Mavis Johnson's son died in an alley. The police called it an accident. The case was closed, the funeral arranged. But when she defied everyone and opened Marcus's coffin, what she saw stopped her breath and ignited a movement. His mouth had been sewn shut. A mother's scream shattered the silence, and a grieving community turned into a wave of outrage. They tried to bury the truth with her son, but Mavis wasn't about to let them. The air in the funeral home did not simply hang heavy, it pressed down. A stifling shroud woven from unspoken grief and the unspoken suspicions that clung to every shadow. Mavis Johnson, her spine an unyielding rod of defiance, sat at the front, a sentinel of sorrow in a room choked with the cloying sweetness of lilies and the metallic tang of unspoken dread. Her son, Marcus, lay within the polished confines of the coffin, a mere few feet away, a chasm of silence where his vibrant laughter once echoed. Every creak of the floorboards, every muffled sob from the rows behind her, amplified the aching void in her chest. She had weathered countless storms, buried a husband far too young, but nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared a mother for bearing a child, especially not Marcus, her intelligent, spirited boy, whose life had been violently ripped away under circumstances the local police had rushed to label a tragic, if regrettable, accident. A cold, hard knot of certainty had formed in Mavis's stomach the moment the sterile voice on the phone delivered the news. An alleyway, a supposed fall, no witnesses, a narrative so neat, so devoid of real inquiry. It felt like a chillingly familiar refrain. It was the same dismissive nonchalance she had come to expect from the precinct whenever a young black man from their community met a sudden, unexplained end. They had taken Marcus's body, performed a perfunctory autopsy, and returned him with an unnerving haste that spoke volumes. The police, a known entity in their neighborhood for their heavy-handed tactics and a systemic disregard for complaints from residents of color, had closed the case with an alarming speed that offered no comfort. Only suspicion. This expediency, rather than easing her pain, had ignited a furious flicker of defiance in Mavis. A mother's instinct screaming that something was profoundly, terrifyingly wrong. She had seen the tired, knowing glances exchanged among her neighbors, the subtle shrugs that conveyed their deep-seated distrust in the official story, their collective silence, born of generations of weary resignation, felt louder than any protest. It was a shared understanding of a system that often sought to bury the truth alongside the victims. Reverend Hayes's eulogy drifted over the congregation, a gentle tapestry of words celebrating Marcus's dreams, his unwavering belief in justice, his quiet acts of kindness. But Mavis barely registered the sounds. Her gaze remained fixed on the closed coffin, a dark, imposing sentinel that held the last physical remnant of her son. The funeral director, Mr. Henderson, whose face was a carefully constructed mask of professional solemnity, had politely but firmly suggested that the coffin remain sealed. For dignity, he'd murmured, his eyes flickering away from hers. But dignity felt like a convenient excuse for concealment. A mother's intuition, honed by decades of navigating a world that often sought to diminish her and hers, screamed a warning. She had insisted on one last moment, a private farewell, an unyielding need to truly see him, to imprint his face in her memory, unmarred by the sterile, impersonal images from the morgue. She ignored the subtle, almost imperceptible head shakes from a few of the uniformed officers present, ostensibly there for security, their presence a cold, unwelcome intrusion that felt more like surveillance than protection. As the ceremony concluded, a thick hush descended upon the packed hall. The community, a sea of somber faces, parted slightly, creating an aisle for Mavis. She rose, her knees protesting, but her resolve unyielding. She moved towards the coffin, a lone figure of raw, dignified grief, her every step an act of determined will. Elijah Grant, a human rights lawyer known for his tireless, often thankless, work within the Black community, who had been introduced to Mavis by a mutual friend concerned about the unsettling circumstances of Marcus's death, stepped to her side. He was a silent, watchful pillar of support, his very presence an acknowledgement that this was more than just a personal tragedy. He had arrived late, slipping into a back pew, observing the scene with keen, analytical eyes. He had sensed the tension, the undercurrent of unspoken questions, the collective suspicion simmering beneath the surface of communal sorrow. Mavis reached the coffin, her hand trembling slightly as she rested it on the cool, polished wood. Mr. Henderson approached, his face a mixture of discomfort and practiced empathy, his voice a low, almost desperate entreaty. "Mrs. Johnson, are you certain? Perhaps it's best to remember him as he was." His hesitation was palpable, a thinly veiled attempt to deter her. "I need to see my son," Mavis stated, her voice clear, though strained, cutting through the stifling air. It was not a request. It was an assertion of maternal right, a demand for truth in the face of veiled obstruction. Mr. Henderson hesitated for another strained beat, then with a sigh that carried a hint of resignation, he nodded. He reached for the latches. A collective intake of breath rippled through the assembled mourners. The soft click of the clasps echoed unnaturally loud in the profound quiet. As the lid slowly ascended, revealing Marcus's peaceful, almost waxen face, a wave of cold, fleeting relief washed over Mavis. He looked just like Marcus, sleeping. But then, her gaze dropped. It was a subtle detail at first, barely perceptible, a faint line around his mouth, darker than the surrounding skin. She leaned closer, her heart beginning to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a terrifying premonition blooming in her chest. What was that a seam? Her mind struggled to comprehend, refusing to acknowledge the impossible. Her breath hitched, her eyes suddenly wide with dawning, suffocating horror. Focused, it was undeniably there, a coarse, dark thread, meticulously woven across his lips, pulling them shut, leaving an ugly, puckered scar where his vibrant smile should have been. Her son's mouth, sewn closed. Not a wound, not a medical procedure. This was a deliberate act, a grotesque violation, a chilling message delivered in the language of brutality. A shiver of pure, unadulterated terror, quickly transmuted into a searing, righteous rage, shot through Mavis. It wasn't just physical desecration, it was a profound, chilling symbol of silencing. They hadn't just killed him, they had tried to steal his voice, to prevent him from ever telling his truth, even in death. A raw, primal scream of anguish and outrage tore from her throat, ripping through the solemn silence of the funeral. It wasn't a gentle sigh of grief, it was the howl of a mother whose son had been brutalized, whose dignity had been desecrated, whose cries for justice had been systematically ignored. The sound shattered the decorum, shattering the carefully constructed peace. Chaos erupted. The community, already a volatile mix of sorrow and simmering resentment, surged forward, gasps and horrified murmurs filling the air. "Oh God," someone cried, their voice thick with disbelief. "Look," another voice, thick with dawning horror, uttered, "They did this." Elijah Grant, quick-thinking and decisive, his face etched with grim realization, rushed forward, his eyes widening in shock as he saw the horrific sight. He reached for Mavis, instinctively trying to steady her, but she was a force unleashed, beyond containment. Her hands flew to the coffin, fingers trembling as they hovered inches from Marcus's sewn lips, as if she could somehow tear away the threads of injustice with sheer will. They silenced him. Mavis shrieked, her voice hoarse with pain and fury. Echoing through the stunned hall, "They silenced my boy. This isn't an accident, this is murder, and they want to bury the truth with him." Her words, though fragmented, resonated with the collective anxieties and unspoken suspicions of the entire community. A wave of outrage, palpable and potent, swept through the mourners. The quiet sorrow transformed into a roaring current of anger. People pushed forward, craning their necks, their faces contorted in expressions of disbelief and horror as the horrific sight was confirmed. The police officers, who had been observing from the back, now moved with an alarming swiftness, their faces tight with a desperate alarm. Two uniformed officers advanced towards the coffin, attempting to block the view, to reassert control with a palpable sense of panic. "Ma'am, please, step away," one ordered, his voice clipped and authoritative, but laced with a desperate urgency. Their attempts to maintain order only fueled the incandescent fury. The community, now seeing the blatant attempt at suppression, became even more agitated. The murmur turned into a roar, a collective cry of indignation, their voices rising in a powerful crescendo. "What are they hiding?" someone shouted, their voice raw with indignation. "They covered it up." Another voice boomed, articulating the pervasive fear that had long festered beneath the surface of their quiet despair. Elijah Grant, ever the strategist, immediately stepped between Mavis and the advancing officers, his stance firm, a legal barrier against their encroachment. "Do not touch her," he commanded, his voice sharp and clear, cutting through the rising din. "Everyone here is a witness. This is a crime scene." He pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen, already documenting the scene, calling for external support, for independent oversight. The sight of the sewn mouth, a chilling testament to brutal suppression, was a public wound inflicted not just on Marcus and Mavis, but on the entire community. It was a deliberate act of public humiliation, a clear message that their lives, their truths, their very voices, held no value in the eyes of the system meant to protect them. The funeral, meant to be a mournful farewell, had exploded into a furious confrontation, a desperate demand for justice, a desperate refusal to be silenced. The very public display of desecration ensured that this tragedy would not be buried quietly, that the truth, however horrific, would begin its painful, inexorable journey towards the light. The initial stunned silence of the mourners gave way to a surge of protective anger, a collective defiance rising to meet the callousness of the unseen perpetrators. Mavis, though trembling, stood her ground, her eyes blazing with an unyielding fire. This was no longer just a mother's grief, it was a battle cry, echoing the unspoken horrors of a community too often silenced. The sudden, grotesque image of Marcus's sewn mouth jolted Mavis back through time, through a lifetime of subtle slights and overt aggressions, of swallowed words and forced smiles in the face of a world that often sought to diminish her. The funeral home, with its swirling chaos of grief and fury, momentarily dissolved into a haze of memories, each one a sharp, stinging reminder of why her community had, for so long, adopted a posture of weary endurance. It wasn't an act of cowardice, it was a strategy for survival, a learned response to a system that consistently proved itself more predatory than protective. She remembered her father, a proud, hardworking man who owned a small auto repair shop on the edge of town, a man who taught her the value of honest labor and quiet dignity. He had been a pillar of their community, a man who fixed cars for single mothers at discounted rates and lent a listening ear to anyone who needed it. One sweltering summer afternoon, when Mavis was barely a teenager, two white police officers, their faces flushed with heat and a thinly veiled arrogance, had pulled up to the shop. They claimed a faulty brake job on a patrol car they'd brought in the previous week, demanding that her father redo the work for free, his impeccable reputation suddenly under attack. Her father, his hands calloused from years of wrenching on engines, had calmly explained the rigorous checks he performed, the quality of his parts. The officers, however, weren't interested in explanations. Their voices grew louder, their postures more aggressive. One of them, a burly man named Officer Miller, had leaned over the counter, his face inches from her father's, and sneered. "You know your place, old man. Don't make us remind you." Mavis, hidden in the shadows of the boss office, had watched, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She saw the flash of humiliation in her father's eyes, the tightening of his jaw, the subtle clenching of his fists. But he hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't fought back. He had simply nodded, a slow, deliberate nod that spoke volumes of forced submission. He redid the brakes, even though he knew he was being unjustly targeted. That night, Mavis found him sitting in the dark, his shoulders slumped, the familiar light in his eyes dimmed. "Some battles, Mavis," he had murmured. "You just gotta endure. Live to fight another day, but choose your battles wisely." It was a lesson etched into her soul, a quiet understanding of the power dynamics that govern their lives. Years later, Marcus was born, a bright, curious boy who questioned everything, whose spirit refused to be contained by societal boxes. Mavis had tried to shield him from the harsh realities, to instill in him the same quiet resilience her father had taught her. But the world had a way of asserting its presence. She remembered the day Marcus, at just 10 years old, had come home from school, his face pale, his small shoulders hunched. He'd been singled out by a teacher, Mrs. Jenkins, for a minor infraction that other white students had committed with impunity. Mrs. Jenkins had made a public spectacle of him, humiliating him in front of the entire class, twisting his innocent explanation into an act of defiance. Mavis had gone to the school, her anger simmering beneath a polite demeanor. She had tried to advocate for Marcus, to explain the clear bias, but the principal, a man with a perpetually dismissive expression, had simply patted her hand, offered platitudes about maintaining discipline, and subtly implied that Marcus was a handful, a thinly veiled accusation of his spirited nature being a problem. The school system, like the police, felt like an impenetrable fortress, designed to uphold a status quo that consistently marginalized Black children. Mavis had learned then that even when you spoke up, your voice could be drowned out, dismissed, or worse, used against you. She had left the principal's office feeling defeated, a familiar hollow ache in her stomach. She had held Marcus close that night, comforting him, but the unspoken message was clear. Even when you're right, the system isn't always fair. Sometimes you just had to grit your teeth and push through. The most potent memory, however, was of the community's collective silence after the brutal beating of Samuel "Sammy" Jones. Sammy was a gentle giant, a beloved elder who ran the neighborhood barbershop, a man who had cut the hair of generations, including Mavis's father and later, Marcus. One evening, Sammy had been found in an alleyway, severely beaten, left for dead. He clung to life for weeks, but the trauma left him a shadow of his former self. His mind fractured. The unofficial word on the streets was that Sammy had witnessed something involving a local police officer in a drug deal gone wrong. Rumors, whispered in hushed tones, circulated about threats, about a cover-up. The police department, predictably, launched an investigation that went nowhere, concluding it was a random street robbery. Despite the community's quiet outrage, the deep-seated fear of retaliation kept most from speaking out. Mavis had seen the fear in the eyes of her neighbors, the way they averted their gazes when the subject of Sammy came up. She understood it. They had families, lives they couldn't risk. They knew that speaking truth to power in their town often came with a devastating cost. A few brave souls had tried to organize protests, but they were quickly met with police intimidation, their efforts stifled, their voices effectively silenced. The message was clear: stay quiet or suffer the consequences. The memory of Sammy, broken and silenced, had been a constant, unspoken warning, a chilling reminder of the dangers of challenging authority. It was a wound that never truly healed for the community, a deep-seated distrust that permeated every interaction with law enforcement. These were the silent lessons, the scars that had formed Mavis's resolve. She had learned to choose her battles, to endure, to survive within a system that seemed designed to crush the spirit. She had taught Marcus the importance of strength, of knowing his worth, but also the nuanced art of navigating a world that might not always recognize it. She had watched him grow into a young man who believed in the power of his voice, who refused to be defined by limitations, who spoke out against injustice even when others remained silent. His courage, his unwavering belief in truth, was a beacon that sometimes filled Mavis with both pride and a quiet dread. She had worried, often, that his outspoken nature would draw the wrong kind of attention. Now, standing over his coffin, staring at the horror of his sewn mouth, every fiber of Mavis's being screamed that this silence, this enduring, this quiet acceptance of injustice, had to end. This was no longer a battle to be endured. This was a war to be fought. They had tried to silence Marcus, but in doing so, they had unleashed a fury that had been simmering within Mavis and within her community for generations. The threads binding his mouth felt like a physical manifestation of all the past slights, all the unaddressed abuses, all the voices that had been stifled, the weight of that collective history, the decades of quiet suffering and unspoken rage, propelled her forward. This desecration, this ultimate act of silencing, was the catalyst. It was the moment Mavis Johnson, the resilient mother, transformed into Mavis Johnson, the unwavering warrior. The silent endurance of the past was shattered, replaced by a roaring demand for justice that would not be silenced. The community's past resignation, born of fear and systemic oppression, was now confronted with an undeniable, grotesque truth. The fight that had begun at the coffin would force them all to confront their history, to choose between continued silence and collective action. The funeral, or rather, the detonation that had once been Marcus's funeral, was over. But for Mavis Johnson, the concept of normal had ceased to exist. The public spectacle of Marcus's desecrated body had ripped open the quiet wounds of their community, exposing the raw, festering truth that had long been suppressed. There was no gentle transition back to everyday life. The air that had been thick with lilies now reeked of apprehension and an unspoken challenge. The world outside the funeral home had already begun to respond, not with sympathy, but with calculated aggression. Within hours of the coffin lid being lowered for the final time, the transformation of Mavis's neighborhood was stark and immediate. Patrol cars, once a sporadic, unwelcome sight, now cruised their streets with an unsettling regularity, their presence less about law enforcement and more about psychological warfare. They moved slowly, deliberately, their tinted windows reflecting the faces of residents with a chilling anonymity. Young men gathered on street corners found themselves subjected to aggressive pat-downs and baseless interrogations. Teenagers walking home from school were stopped, their backpacks rummaged through, their IDs demanded with brusque authority. The gentle rhythm of neighborhood life was replaced by a taut, anxious silence. Children, usually playing freely, were now called inside earlier, their laughter muted by the heavy atmosphere of surveillance. The familiar faces of neighbors, usually greeting each other with easy smiles, now exchanged wary glances, their conversations hushed, their eyes constantly darting towards the passing cruisers. The systemic abuse had shifted from the shadows to the glaring light of day. A blatant message from the local police challenged us, and we will make your lives a living hell. Mavis herself became the focal point of this intensified scrutiny. Her modest home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a fishbowl. Unmarked cars idled suspiciously down the street, their occupants seemingly engrossed in newspapers or their phones, but their gazes always seemed to snap back to her front door. Her phone, which had previously rung with the friendly chatter of neighbors, now often received hang-up calls or strange, distorted voicemails. A few days after the funeral, a zoning inspector appeared at her door, demanding access to her backyard, citing an anonymous complaint about unregistered structures. There were no unregistered structures. It was a thinly veiled act of harassment, a low-grade intimidation tactic designed to chip away at her composure. Mavis, though shaken, refused him entry without a warrant, quoting the law with a steady voice she didn't know she possessed. The inspector, clearly annoyed by her unexpected resistance, retreated with a mumbled threat about future inspections. Elijah Grant, the human rights lawyer, had remained a constant presence, navigating the legal complexities with a calm precision that belied the rising pressure. He immediately filed a formal complaint with the state's Attorney General's office, regarding the police department's conduct at the funeral and the subsequent community harassment. He knew it was a long shot, given the deep-seated political connections of the local police chief, but it was a necessary first step. He held impromptu community meetings, often in the back room of Reverend Hayes's church, explaining their rights, documenting every instance of police misconduct, and offering a vital sense of solidarity. He cautioned them about entrapment, about provoking confrontations, urging them to record interactions, to be witnesses for one another. His efforts brought a fragile sense of empowerment, but also made him a target. He found himself increasingly tailed by unmarked cars, his office receiving anonymous threats, his reputation subtly undermined by local media outlets known to be sympathetic to the police. The local news, normally quick to sensationalize any incident in their community, maintained an eerie silence about the funeral. No mention of the sewn mouth, no interviews with Mavis. The official narrative remained Marcus's tragic accident, with fleeting mentions of heightened community tensions and a mother's understandable grief. It was a deliberate media blackout, a clear indication that the powerful forces at play were actively controlling the flow of information, desperate to suppress the truth. Mavis tried to reach out to a reporter she knew, Tanya, a young, ambitious journalist who had always seemed more willing to question authority. Tanya listened sympathetically, but her voice was tight with fear. "Mavis, I wish I could," Tanya whispered over the phone. "But my editor shut it down, said it was too sensitive, too unsubstantiated." "I'm getting pressure gnawing from above. Real pressure." The phone call confirmed Mavis's chilling realization the cover-up extended far beyond the precinct walls, reaching into the very institutions meant to shed light on injustice. Despite the pervasive fear and the systematic attempts to isolate her, Mavis found unexpected sources of strength within her community. Marcus's friends, young men who had once revered his outspokenness, now stood taller, their eyes reflecting a newfound determination. They quietly began documenting police harassment on their phones, sharing stories, creating an informal network of citizen journalists. Older women, matriarchs of the neighborhood, brought Mavis food, their embraces tight, their eyes conveying a silent promise of support. They spoke in parables, in whispers of past injustices, of times when the community had to band together. They reminded her that she was not alone. One evening, as Mavis sat on her porch, the familiar rumble of a patrol car approaching, she noticed a small, white dog, a terrier mix she sometimes saw wandering the streets, suddenly bark fiercely at the vehicle, its tail wagging furiously in a seemingly defiant challenge. The officers in the car, startled, sped up, clearly annoyed by the unexpected canine disruption. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched Mavis's lips. Even the animal sensed the injustice, refusing to be silenced. It was a fleeting, almost absurd moment, but it served as a small, unexpected burst of levity in the suffocating tension, a tiny symbol of unyielding resistance. Her days were now a relentless cycle of grief and strategic resistance. She spent hours in Elijah Grant's makeshift office, reviewing documents, retelling the story of the funeral, every detail etched into her memory. She learned about civil rights law, about evidence collection, about the bureaucratic maze designed to wear down petitioners. She discovered that the official autopsy report on Marcus was curiously vague, omitting any mention of the ligature marks around his mouth, describing the cause of death simply as blunt force trauma consistent with a fall. It was a deliberate omission, a lie by negation, that solidified her conviction. Mavis realized that simply trying to live normally was an act of defiance in itself. Every time she stepped out her door, every time she refused to cower before the cruising patrol cars, every time she spoke to a neighbor about the truth of Marcus's death, she was resisting. Her normalcy was redefined. It was no longer about quiet endurance, but about the steady, unyielding pursuit of justice in the face of overwhelming pressure. The systematic abuse was not breaking her. It was forging her into a sharper, more resolute instrument of change. The pressure was intense, designed to wear her down, to make her retreat, to make her surrender to the official lie, but with every new act of intimidation, with every dismissive glance from an officer, her resolve hardened. They had tried to silence Marcus, and now they were trying to silence her. But Mavis Johnson was no longer a woman who would choose silence. She was a woman who had seen the truth, and the truth, no matter how brutal, demanded to be spoken. The funeral had been the public humiliation. The days that followed were the systematic, insidious attempts to erase that humiliation and the truth it revealed. But Mavis, far from retreating, was instead preparing for the battle ahead. The systematic abuse, designed to wear Mavis down, had instead ignited a cold, unwavering flame of defiance within her. The subtle threats and overt surveillance, far from making her cower, had clarified her purpose. The truth of Marcus's death, the grotesque spectacle of his sewn mouth, was a fire she could no longer contain. It demanded to be seen, to be heard, to ignite a wider reckoning. Her first act of resistance, seemingly small but imbued with powerful symbolism, began with Marcus's grave. The funeral home, under pressure from the police, had hastily provided a simple, unmarked headstone, a bland slab of granite that offered no personal inscription, no testament to the vibrant life it commemorated. It felt like another attempt to erase Marcus, to bury his story along with his body. Mavis would not allow it. She commissioned a local artisan, a quiet, older man from the community named Mr. Eli, who understood the unspoken language of their grief. Together, they designed a new headstone, one that boldly declared Marcus's name, his birth and death dates, and beneath them, a single etched image, a mouth, slightly parted, with a delicate, almost imperceptible thread of gold running across it. It was subtle enough to be missed by a casual observer, but for those who knew, for those who understood, it was a searing indictment, a permanent, silent scream against the injustice. When the stone was finally set, gleaming defiance in the morning sun, Mavis stood before it, her hand resting on the golden thread, a silent vow passing between mother and son. It was a reclaiming of narrative, a defiance etched in stone. But Mavis knew that stone alone wasn't enough. The truth needed a voice, a public forum. She began by sharing her story, not in hushed whispers, but with a quiet, powerful clarity. She started at Reverend Hayes's church during the weekly community gathering. Initially, the attendees were hesitant, their faces a mixture of fear and sympathy. But Mavis, standing before them, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, recounted the horror of the funeral, the shocking discovery, the chilling implications. She didn't sensationalize. She simply stated the facts. Her grief a raw, potent amplifier of her words. As she spoke, the initial fear in the congregation began to transform into something else, a collective anger, a deep-seated recognition of their shared vulnerability. Women nodded, their eyes glistening with tears. Men clenched their jaws, their fists tightening. For many, it was the first time someone had openly articulated the unspoken anxieties that plagued their lives. Elijah Grant, ever strategic, helped Mavis organize larger, more formal meetings. They rented a small community hall, discreetly spreading the word through trusted networks. These gatherings became safe spaces, forums for shared trauma and collective action. People began to step forward, tentative at first, then with increasing confidence, sharing their own stories of police harassment, of loved ones who had died under questionable circumstances, of systemic discrimination in local institutions. A young woman spoke of her brother, arrested for loitering simply for waiting for a bus. An elderly man recounted being stopped and searched for walking in his own neighborhood after dark. The stories, raw and painful, wove together into a damning tapestry of systemic abuse. Mavis listened, her heart aching with empathy, her resolve hardening with every new testimony. Each story was another thread in the tapestry of injustice, strengthening her resolve to unravel it. Word of Mavis's crusade began to spread beyond their immediate community. The local media, still under the influence of powerful forces, continued its blackout, but independent journalists, drawn by whispers of the extraordinary events at Marcus's funeral, began to take notice. Tanya, the young journalist Mavis had spoken to earlier, despite her editor's warnings, felt a growing sense of journalistic integrity tugging at her. She started researching, making discreet inquiries, slowly piecing together a hidden narrative of police misconduct in the city. She couldn't publish anything yet, but she was building a case, a dossier of truth that would be impossible to ignore. A particularly poignant act of resistance came from a group of Marcus's closest friends, inspired by Mavis's unwavering courage. They started wearing small, black armbands, not as a sign of mourning, but as a subtle symbol of defiance. On the armbands and armbands, they had embroidered a tiny, barely visible golden thread, mirroring the one on Marcus's headstone. They wore them everywhere, to school, to their bars, to community events. It was a silent, visual protest, a way to honor Marcus and to subtly signal their solidarity with Mavis. The police, patrolling the streets, noticed the armbands, their expressions tightening, but they could find no legal reason to stop or question the young men for wearing them. It was a small act, easily overlooked by outsiders, but within the community, it was a powerful statement of unity and a refusal to be intimidated. The most unexpected, and perhaps most heartwarming. Act of resistance came from the small, white terrier mix Mavis had seen barking at the patrol car. The ding, whom Mavis had begun to call Guardian, seemed to have adopted pure harm. He would often be found curled up on her porch, standing guard. Whenever a patrol car passed, Guardian would erupt in a flurry of barks, a fierce, protective defiance emanating from his small frame. The officers, clearly perturbed by the persistent, noisy opposition, would often accelerate, their annoyance palpable. One evening, as Mavis was returning home from a community meeting, a group of plainclothes officers were leaning against an unmarked car near her house, their eyes fixed on her. Just as she felt a chill of apprehension, Guardian emerged from the shadows, barking furiously, running in tight circles around the officer's legs. They cursed, swatting at him, clearly irritated by the unexpected nuisance. The diversion allowed Mavis to reach her door safely, her heart swelling with a mix of relief and unexpected gratitude for the loyal, four-legged protector. Guardian wasn't just a time, he was a furry, feisty embodiment of unwavering loyalty and a surprising symbol of their collective resistance. His presence was a constant, small reminder that even the most vulnerable could find a way to bark back at oppression. This unexpected alliance, a resilient mother and a defiant stray, became a quiet symbol of the community's refusal to be silenced, their first acts of open defiance against the systemic oppression that had long held them captive. The fight had officially begun, not with a bang, but with a whisper, a silent scream etched in stone, and the determined barks of a loyal dog. The systematic abuse, designed to wear Mavis down, had instead forged a cold, unwavering flame of defiance within her. The subtle threats and overt surveillance, far from making her cower, had clarified her purpose. The truth of Marcus's death, the grotesque spectacle of his sewn mouth, was a fire she could no longer contain. It demanded to be seen, to be heard, to ignite a wider reckoning. The quiet acts of resistance had culminated in a singular, public demand for accountability, a special session of the City Council, called by Mavis and Elijah Grant, to address the community's grievances concerning Marcus Johnson's death and the widespread pattern of police misconduct. The day of the session dawned under a sky the color of bruised steel, mirroring the tension that hung heavy over the city. Word had spread like wildfire. Buses, usually carrying commuters, now ferried community members from every corner of the district towards City Hall. A throng had gathered outside, a sea of faces mirroring Mavis's grim determination. Chants of justice for Marcus and no more silence echoed off the stoic stone facade of the municipal building. Marcus's friends, identifiable by their subtle golden-threaded armbands, moved through the crowd, distributing flyers and encouraging more voices. Tanya, The young journalist was there, blending in, her camera discreetly ready, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and journalistic anticipation. Inside the council chambers, every seat was taken, and people spilled into the aisles, lining the walls, their gazes fixed on the elevated dais where the city council members, a nervous mix of elected officials and politically appointed department heads, sat. At the center sat Police Chief Thompson, his face a mask of strained composure, flanked by Captain Hayes, notorious for his heavy-handed tactics. Mavis walked into the chambers, flanked by Elijah Grant and Reverend Hayes, a formidable trio. Her steps were slow, deliberate, each one an affirmation of her unyielding resolve. Her gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of her neighbors, her community, in their faces. She saw not just grief, but a burgeoning courage. She saw the fear that had once paralyzed them, now tempered by a collective hunger for truth. The atmosphere inside was suffocating, a thick blend of anticipation and thinly veiled aggression from the authorities. The air crackled with a silent, volatile energy. The council president, a man named Sterling that had a reputation for towing the line, cleared his throat, his voice unnaturally loud in the hushed chamber. We are gathered today to address the concerns raised by Mrs. Mavis Johnson and attorney Elijah Grant regarding the recent tragic passing of Marcus Johnson and general community relations with the police department. His tone was dismissive, an attempt to frame the session as a bureaucratic formality rather than the watershed moment it was. Elijah Grant was the first to speak, his voice calm but resonant, laying out the facts, the inconsistencies in the official police report, the alarming speed of the investigation. He detailed the pattern of harassment in the community, the attempts to silence those who questioned authority. He spoke with the precision of a surgeon, dissecting the official narrative. He then turned to Mavis. Mrs. Johnson, will you please share your testimony? Mavis rose, the collective breath of the chamber held. She approached the microphone, her hands steady, her gaze unwavering as she looked directly at Chief Thompson. My son, Marcus, was a good boy, she began, her voice clear, though tinged with raw emotion. He believed in justice. He spoke his mind. And for that, I believe, they killed him. A ripple went through the crowd. Chief Thompson shifted in his seat, a vein throbbing faintly in his temple. At his funeral, Mavis continued, her voice gaining strength, each word a hammer blow against the wall of silence. I opened his coffin, and I saw what they did to him. They silenced him, even in death. She paused, letting the full horror of her words hang in the air. They sewed his mouth shut. A collective gasp echoed through the chamber, quickly followed by murmurs of outrage. Council members exchanged uneasy glances. Chief Thompson slammed a hand on the table, a sharp crack in the tension. Mrs. Johnson, this is highly inappropriate, he roared, his mask of composure finally cracking. These are baseless accusations. Baseless. Chief, Elijah interjected, stepping forward, a thick manila envelope in his hand. We think not. He turned to the council. Members of the council, and all present, the official autopsy report for Marcus Johnson stated the cause of death as blunt force trauma consistent with a fall. It made no mention of any other abnormalities. He paused for dramatic effect. However, a private, independent autopsy, commissioned by Mrs. Johnson due to her grave concerns, tells a very different story. He pulled out a series of large, laminated photographs and projected them onto the screen behind the dais. The first was a stark, undeniable image of Marcus's face in the coffin, his lips clearly sewn shut with a dark, thick thread. A collective shudder went through the room. These are photographs taken at his funeral by a trusted member of this community, Elijah stated, his voice ringing with authority. But more than that, the independent forensic pathologist's report confirms not only the ligature marks around his mouth, but also reveals severe trauma to the throat, inconsistent with a mere fall, suggesting a struggle. And more importantly, a deliberate attempt to obstruct breathing or vocalization prior to death. The chamber erupted. Whispers turned into shouts. Reporters in the press gallery began furiously scribbling notes. Tanya, her hands shaking slightly, captured the images on her phone. Chief Thompson leaped to his feet, his face apoplectic. This is a fabrication, a grotesque smear campaign. These so-called independent reports are completely inadmissible. They are admissible as evidence in a court of public opinion. Chief, Elijah retorted, his voice cutting through the din, and they will be admissible in a court of law. He then produced a printed document. Furthermore, after the funeral, members of this community, inspired by Mrs. Johnson's courage, began to document every instance of police harassment. We have compiled dozens of sworn affidavits, video recordings, and time-stamped accounts of intimidation and undue force. He held up a thick binder. And we have a witness. A hush fell. Elijah looked towards a side door, which slowly opened. A figure entered. A man whose face was etched with fear, but whose eyes held a flicker of desperate resolve. It was Officer David Lee, a younger officer who had been stationed at the funeral. A man known to be quietly uncomfortable with the department's methods. He walked slowly to the microphone, his gaze avoiding Chief Thompson's murderous stare. Officer Lee, Elijah prompted gently, can you tell the council what you witnessed regarding Marcus Johnson's death? Lee swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper at first, then gaining strength. I was on patrol that night. Near the alley, I saw Captain Hayes and two other officers. They had Marcus. They were roughing him up. He was screaming. They told him to shut up. And then, I heard a choke, a muffled sound, and then Captain Hayes. He said, Picoyo. He won't be talking to anyone anymore. And then they pulled him into the alley. I heard a thud. I didn't see the rest, but I know they did something. And the next morning, I saw Captain Hayes give Mr. Henderson, the funeral director, an envelope. And later, I heard about the mouth. His voice broke, heavy with guilt and fear. The chamber exploded once more, this time with a roar of disbelief, anger, and vindication. The crowd outside, hearing the commotion, pressed closer to the building, their chants growing louder. Chief Thompson lunged forward, shouting, Officer Lee, you are lying. This is insubordination. You're suspended, effective immediately. But his words were drowned out by the shouts of the community, the hammering of gavels from the council president, and the urgent whispers of reporters. The truth, meticulously gathered by Mavis and Elijah, and powerfully delivered by a terrified but resolute witness, was out. The facade of systemic control had shattered. The racist power, confident in its ability to suppress, was suddenly exposed, reeling under the weight of undeniable evidence and the collective outcry of a community that had finally found its voice. The confrontation was no longer just about Marcus. It was about the systemic corruption, the years of abuse, and the demand for a complete irreversible change. Mavis stood tall, her eyes fixed on Chief Thompson, a silent testament to the undeniable power of a mother's love and an awakened community's resolve. The battle had escalated, and the fight for justice had entered its most crucial, public phase. The climactic confrontation at City Hall sent shockwaves far beyond the council chambers. The raw, undeniable truth, delivered with Mavis's unflinching honesty and Officer Lee's terrified testimony, had fractured the city's carefully constructed facade of order. The consequences were immediate, far-reaching, and for many, a long overdue reckoning. Within hours of Officer Lee's shattering testimony, the first domino fell. Chief Thompson, his face a mask of fury and humiliation, was seen being escorted from City Hall by plainclothes detectives, not from the local precinct, but from a state-level internal affairs unit discreetly called in by the State Attorney General's office after Elijah Grant's initial complaint and intensified by the widespread community outcry. The swiftness of his removal suggested that the evidence presented, particularly the corroborating independent autopsy and the damning testimony of one of his own officers, was simply too overwhelming to ignore. even for a politically entrenched figure like Thompson. The local news, finally breaking its self-imposed silence, reported on the chief's indefinite leave of absence, a euphemism for his effective suspension pending a full investigation. The police department, once an impenetrable monolith, now reeled under the weight of public scrutiny. Captain Hayes, directly implicated by Officer Lee's testimony, was immediately placed on administrative leave, stripped of his badge and weapon. Unlike Thompson's somewhat discreet removal, Hayes' suspension was a very public spectacle, designed to reassure a furious populace. Uniformed officers, who had long feared his brutal reputation, watched with a mixture of apprehension and grim satisfaction as he was led away. His alleged accomplices, the two other officers mentioned by Lee, were also suspended. Their names circulated through official channels for internal investigation. The department, in a desperate attempt to quell the burgeoning unrest, issued a terse public statement promising a thorough and transparent investigation and pledging full cooperation with state authorities. Few in the community believed them, but the swiftness of the response was a clear indication of the immense pressure they were now under. The following days saw a flurry of activity. State investigators descended upon the precinct, sifting through records, interviewing officers, and seizing potential evidence. The local district attorney's office, initially hesitant to pursue the case vigorously, now found itself under immense public pressure. Protests, fueled by Mavis's bravery and the revelations at City Hall, erupted daily at the Bullet Police Station and City Hall, growing in size and fervor. The chants of justice for Marcus morphed into Mara, arrest the crooked cops, and resign now. The anger was no longer simmering, it was boiling over. The community's response was unprecedented. The shared trauma of Marcus's death, amplified by the grotesque detail of his sewn mouth, had served as a powerful catalyst. People who had lived in quiet resignation for decades found their voices. The community meetings organized by Mavis and Elijah Grant swelled in attendance, becoming hubs of organization and emotional support. Residents formed neighborhood watch groups, not to police themselves, but to monitor police activity, documenting every interaction, creating a detailed ledger of potential abuses. An elderly woman, known for her meek demeanor, even started a petition for a civilian review board with subpoena power, gathering hundreds of signatures within days. The fear that had once silenced them had transformed into a potent force for change. The sense of isolation and powerlessness began to dissipate, replaced by a powerful sense of collective agency. Financial support poured in from unexpected corners. Small donations from sympathetic individuals and civil rights organizations began to fill a legal fund established by Elijah Grant, ensuring that Mavis's fight for justice would not be hampered by lack of resources. Local businesses, initially wary of alienating the police, now quietly offered their support, their owners sensing the shifting tides of public opinion. The collective action created a protective shield around Mavis and Officer Lee, a clear message to the authorities that any retaliation against them would be met with overwhelming public condemnation. Officer Lee, though ostracized by many of his former colleagues and living under the constant threat of retribution, found a surprising source of support within the community. Reverend Hayes' church offered him temporary sanctuary, and concerned citizens brought him meals and words of encouragement. His bravery, though born of immense fear, was seen as a profound act of moral courage, a crack in the wall of silence from within the system itself. His testimony, recorded and replayed across national news, became a potent symbol of hope for other communities struggling with similar injustices. Tanya, the determined journalist, finally got her scoop. With the state investigation officially underway and the public outcry reaching a fever pitch, her editor could no longer hold back. Her exposé, detailing the sewn mouth, the independent autopsy, Officer Lee's testimony, and the long history of police misconduct, broke on the front page of the regional newspaper and quickly went viral online. The story, meticulously researched and powerfully written, brought national attention to the small city, transforming Marcus Johnson's death from a local tragedy into a national symbol of systemic racism and police brutality. News crews from major networks descended upon the city, their cameras rolling, their microphones thrust into the faces of distraught residents and stone-faced officials. The pressure mounted daily, forcing the authorities to confront the ugly truth they had tried so desperately to bury. The legal proceedings began to move with a speed that was both gratifying and dizzying. Grand jury indictments were almost certain, fueled by the compelling evidence and the relentless glare of the national spotlight. The community, once fractured and fearful, had coalesced into an unstoppable force. Marcus's death, a senseless tragedy, had become a catalyst for profound systemic change. Mavis, though still grieving, felt a new sense of purpose, a fierce determination to ensure that her son's sacrifice would not be in vain. The consequences of that fateful funeral had just begun to unfold, promising a long, arduous, but ultimately transformative journey towards justice. The system, once seemingly impenetrable, was now on trial, its deepest flaws laid bare for all to see. The immediate aftermath of the City Hall confrontation was a whirlwind of legal maneuvering, public outcry, and a slow, process of dismantling the established power structure. Mavis, though still anchored by her grief, found herself propelled into a new role, that of an accidental, yet formidable, leader. Her home, once a quiet sanctuary, transformed into a hub of activity, bustling with lawyers, community organizers, and journalists vying for her time and testimony. The public impact of her revelation was seismic. The images of Marcus's sewn mouth, searingly projected onto the national consciousness through Tanya's expose and subsequent news coverage, sparked outrage across the country. Major civil rights organizations, recognizing the profound symbolism of the desecration, swiftly offered their full support, sending legal teams, community outreach specialists, and media liaisons. Conferences were held, rallies organized in solidarity, and the Justice for Marcus Johnson movement gained powerful momentum, becoming a rallying cry against police brutality and systemic silencing. The story was no longer just about a small city's corruption. It was about a universal struggle for dignity and accountability. On a local level, the community's awakening continued to deepen. The fear that had once paralyzed them had fully dissipated, replaced by an invigorating sense of collective power. The Civilian Review Board petition, initially met with skepticism, gained undeniable traction. Thousands of signatures poured in, undeniable proof of the public's demand for oversight. Local politicians, once aligned with the discredited police chief, now scrambled to distance themselves, making public statements of concern and pledging support for police reform initiatives. The shift in political winds was palpable, a testament to the community's unwavering pressure. The legal process, though slow, was methodical and relentless. A grand jury, convened with unusual swiftness due to the intense public and media scrutiny, handed down indictments against Chief Thompson, Captain Hayes, and the two other officers involved in Marcus's death. The charges ranged from obstruction of justice and conspiracy to depraved heart murder, directly referencing the independent autopsy findings in Officer Lee's testimony. The trial dates were set, drawing national media attention, promising a legal battle that would unfold under the unforgiving glare of public opinion. Elijah Grant, now a nationally recognized figure, worked tirelessly, assembling a formidable legal team, preparing for what would undoubtedly be a grueling, high-stakes battle. Mavis, however, remained the unwavering moral compass of the movement. She understood that legal victories, while crucial, were only one part of the battle. The deeper struggle was about changing hearts and minds, about shifting the narrative from one of passive victimhood to active empowerment. She began sharing her story more widely, not just through formal channels, but through informal conversations, speaking engagements at colleges, and interviews on independent podcasts. Her voice, clear and resonant, carried the weight of her personal tragedy, but also the universal message of resilience and resistance. She spoke of Marcus's dreams, his vibrant spirit, and the injustice that had silenced him. She transformed her profound grief into a powerful narrative of hope and action. she initiated a foundation in Marcus's name, the Marcus Johnson Voice Foundation, dedicated to providing legal aid and support for families affected by police brutality and systemic injustice. The foundation quickly gained recognition, attracting donations and volunteers from across the country. Its mission was clear: to ensure that no other family would suffer in silence, that every silenced voice would find an advocate, and that every act of injustice would be met with an unwavering pursuit of truth. The foundation also focused on community education, organizing workshops on civil rights, how to interact with law enforcement, and methods of documenting police misconduct. The impact of Mavis's journey was profound on individuals. Officer Lee, though still facing immense personal and professional challenges, found a renewed sense of purpose. He began working with Elijah Grant in the foundation, offering his insider perspective on police practices, advocating for departmental reform, and speaking out against the culture of silence. His courage inspired other officers, quietly at first, then more openly, to question the ethics of their own departments. Tanya, the journalist, continued her investigative work, her articles now regularly exposing other instances of corruption and abuse in different cities. Solidifying her reputation as a fearless advocate for truth, her work became an indispensable part of the movement, shedding light on the darker corners of systemic injustice. The community, having experienced the transformative power of collective action, began to heal, albeit slowly. The wounds were deep, but the shared struggle had forged new bonds of solidarity and trust. Neighbors, who had once lived in quiet suspicion, now organized communal meals, shared resources, and stood together in peaceful protest. The children, who had once been called inside, now played freely under the watchful, but no longer fearful, eyes of their parents. The atmosphere in the neighborhood, though still tinged with the memory of past suffering, was infused with a newfound sense of hope and collective agency. The fear of reprisal had been replaced by the quiet strength of unity. Mavis, at the heart of it all, continued her tireless work. She wasn't seeking revenge. She was seeking justice, accountability, and systemic change. She carried Marcus's memory not as a burden, but as a torch, illuminating the path forward. Her unwavering resolve, born from the deepest grief, transformed her into a symbol of courage and an undeniable force for good. The initial devastation had given way to a powerful movement, driven by a mother's love and a community's refusal to remain silent. The narrative of their lives was no longer dictated by oppression, but by their unwavering commitment to truth and the unwavering pursuit of justice.